There's been some higher education news lately that I sort of want to go over. Some of you may have seen that earlier this month, Republican Senator Tom Cotton introduced what he calls an ivory tower tax to punish so-called woke universities. Cotton's bill proposes a 1% tax on endowments held by the wealthiest universities, which of course include Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale. In a statement, Cotton said, "Our wealthiest colleges and universities have amassed billions of dollars virtually tax-free, all while indoctrinating our youth with un-American ideas. This bill will impose a tax on university mega endowments and support vocational and apprenticeship training programs in order to create high-paying working-class jobs." So before we unpack Cotton's fear-mongering over, quote, un-American ideas, I do want to say that a tax on private university endowments is actually not a bad idea. Let's take a look at the assets of the top 5 wealthiest schools in the country. At the top of the heap, of course, is Harvard, which has an endowment of more than $40 billion. Next is Yale with over $30 billion, and all the way in 5th place is MIT with a measly $17 billion. So as Cotton noted, these endowments are tax exempt, and schools typically do not spend down a significant portion of these endowments each year. In other words, endowments often function as convenient tax shelters for elite institutions, and schools regularly shell out far more for managing these endowments than they do on helping students with tuition. According to the New York Times, in 2012, Harvard used around $242 million from its endowment on tuition assistance. But by contrast, in 2014, it paid $362 million in private equity fees alone and nearly $1 billion in total investment management fees. So this has not escaped the attention of the left. For instance, in the past, Matt Bruenig, who is the director of the People's Policy Project, has also proposed taxing private university endowments in order to create and fund federal public universities. But all that said, Tom Cotton's bill is of course not about expanding access to education or about redistributing wealth. It's only Republican culture war posturing. We know Cotton has no real interest in redistribution or in policies that would help the working class. After all, although he now wants to tax a very specific pocket of wealth that he associates with so-called un-American ideas, in 2017, he famously voted in favor of Trump's massive tax cuts for corporations and for the rich. He's also since opposed tax hikes on capital gains, he's opposed tax increases on the wealthiest 1%, and he's even rejected Bernie Sanders' proposal for a $15 minimum wage. In other words, Tom Cotton is obviously a culture warrior and not any kind of economic populist. But unfortunately, he's not the only one. Democrats could easily call Cotton's bluff on this issue by saying, we also support taxing university endowments, along with taxing foundation endowments, Wall Street speculation, corporations, and billionaires. But lately, when it comes to higher education, liberals have been tied up in their own culture wars. For instance, take the subject of the SATs and other standardized testing in college admissions. The University of California system recently announced it would stop using SAT and ACT scores in its admissions process. So this decision came in the wake of a lawsuit from several racial justice and disability rights groups that alleged that standardized tests like the ACTs were inherently biased against Black and Latino students and disabled students. Now, of course, the SATs and other standardized tests are flawed and incomplete in many ways. Of course, they do reflect many socioeconomic and racial inequalities in education. Affluent white and Asian students tend to score higher on these tests than their Black and Latino counterparts. But as the writer Freddie DeBoer has pointed out, liberals vastly overstate the degree to which the tests themselves perpetuate inequality. For all the ire that standardized testing has attracted from progressives, a new study from Stanford's Center for Education Policy Analysis shows that college admissions essays, which are supposedly a more holistic measure of a student's ability than the SATs, actually correlate even more strongly with household income than SAT scores. In some ways, this should be kind of obvious. The quality and content of a student's college essay benefits immensely from their social, cultural, and economic capital. As Freddie has written, there is absolutely no reason to believe that holistic admissions aren't subject to capture by the moneyed. Money can absolutely get a privileged teen into a summer program building houses for low-income families in the Andes, intersectional as well as holistic, fencing lessons, decent at a rare sport is better than being great at a common sport unless it's football or basketball, and a writing workshop, obsessive about one interest rather than casual about several in today's admissions game. So what's actually going on with the University of California scrapping the SATs? The primary goal of this move is to diversify its disproportionately Asian and white student body without running afoul of the California law that explicitly prohibits schools from considering applicants' race in admissions. Now, if diversifying the UC schools seems like an admirable goal, consider the fact that tuition at the University of California has risen significantly over the last several decades. As you can see from this graph from the California Budget and Policy Center, the average annual tuition at a UC school in 1980 was around $2,000 adjusted for inflation. In 2019, it was over $14,000. And in fact, just this month, UC leaders proposed instituting yet another tuition hike to begin next year. It's no secret that higher education is increasingly unaffordable for the majority of Americans, which means that the push to diversify universities in the face of steeply rising costs is really only a push to diversify a shrinking resource. And when it comes to the most elite schools, the push to diversify those is really a push to diversify the ruling class. Ivy League schools like Harvard have doubled down on their commitment recently to racially diversifying their incoming classes. Yet at Harvard, tuition plus room and board cost nearly $74,000 in 2020, and the average Harvard student's family income is over $168,000. 60% of Harvard students, in other words, a supermajority, comes from the top 20% of income earners. Fighting to diversify the top echelon of society while economic inequality worsens profoundly is the epitome of progressive neoliberalism, or what the sociologist Dylan Riley has called a profoundly unequal but rigorously equitable form of capitalism. Meanwhile, there's been little consensus among politicians on how to curb soaring tuition costs. Biden's American Families Plan does include a provision for free community college, and a new bill introduced by Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal goes a step further in also making four-year public colleges tuition-free for families earning under $125,000 annually. Sanders and Jayapal have proposed paying for this legislation with a new tax on Wall Street. But of course, the bill is a long shot in a divided Congress, and it goes without saying that we've heard not a peep from Tom Cotton on this particular wealth tax. According to the Pew Research Center, a majority of adults in the US favor making public colleges tuition-free. This includes 30% of adults who strongly favor the idea. It's a sorry state of affairs when this broadly popular idea has to fall by the wayside for the culture wars, whether that's Republicans' faux populist railing against, quote, un-American colleges, or the liberal preoccupation with diversifying elite institutions that are out of reach for the majority of working class people. So I will wrap it up there. Paul, I know you probably have some thoughts on college and standardized testing, but I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, can we first just go back to like $40 billion
I know.
of an endowment? I mean, they're on the level of a Fortune 500 company. That's just ridiculous. And, in Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania is deemed a mega, quote unquote, nonprofit. So they have a $14 billion endowment. They don't have to pay any property taxes in that. They can, if they want to, do voluntary payments. But so that means that, the public school district is losing out on all this money that should be collected from this $14 billion endowment that, like you said, it's just sitting there. It's not really being They've researched and shown that it's not really being used for their operating costs and things like that. I mean, they just still collected tuition when kids were at home during COVID, But I think this is like another example of the right wing outflanking the Democrats on these working class issues. I mean, that quote from Tom Cotton, there was nothing I disagreed there, except the part about, they're here to indoctrinate us and un-American views, but all the rest of it sounded great to me. And, going back to I think really starting with Nixon, the right wing has been able to skillfully deflect anger to the economic elite, or from the economic elite to the so-called cultural elite, and associate the left with the cultural elite. And that's, still going on now. And I think the free college for all demand is good because, we don't have to go into like anti-intellectualism for its sake. Like we're saying that higher education is valuable. People should be able to do it if they want to, but we can still name the enemy. And the enemy is the elite that runs these universities and are basically ripping us all off. And we know it by doing that. But again, it's just another kind of scary example of the right wing kind of being, they're outflanking the Democrats. And, people are going to justifiably be more angry at these institutions that are just putting people in more and more debt and not really showing much, value to society as a whole.
Yeah, I think the point that you made about UPenn is really interesting because when I was thinking about these massive endowments, the first thing I thought about was like especially, with the private Ivy League universities, like tuition is insane. Why aren't they putting more of that endowment toward the actual running of the college? Why aren't they admitting more people? Why aren't they lowering tuition costs? But what you brought up is yet another downside of just hoarding or sitting on top of this giant endowment, which is that you're disadvantaging the city, that you draw resources from.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And they're also huge employers, and I'm sure, the wages of all the different campus workers could benefit from some of that endowment money, money going to them. But, I think once again, liberals are going to paint themselves in the corner of like, well, in this age, we need truth, we need science, and the universities are after MSNBC, they're our second best last beacon of hope, to save democracy. And, putting yourself on the side of these, wealthy institutions, essentially, that are at the expense of everyone else. And again, it's just a bad position to be in. And I think a lot of liberals are going to run straight to that position to be on the side of the university as an institution.
I just wanted to quickly ask also if you had any thoughts about kind of this ongoing like culture war over diversifying higher ed, because I think on the one hand, like obviously like we want our institutions to be diverse. I don't think, anybody on the show, I mean, even Walter Ben Michaels, our friend Walter Ben Michaels, like likes diversity, like believe it or not. But I think the key here is that there's such a hyper focus on these extremely elite institutions that I think it really sucks up a lot of the energy and a lot of the air out of, broader discussions such as free college for all, right? So, I can't remember. I mean, I'm sure many people have noticed or have observed this, but like, even if the Ivy League universities were like completely representative of the racial makeup of the rest of the country, like how many people go to Ivy League universities? Like that's still like millions and millions of college kids who aren't at those universities. That does nothing to solve the funding crisis for public universities. And it's just, I feel like it's such a distraction.
Yeah, and what's kind of ironic is that actually, if you really want to diversify higher ed, you would make it more affordable.
Right,
I mean, it's very simple. And I mean, one of my years teaching, I taught seniors, and I mean, it was actually really sad. I mean, I'm in a district it's a high poverty district, mostly Black and Latino students, and the whole focus the whole year for these seniors was the FAFSA form. How am I going to pay for this? And many they just did not go to college because they could not afford it. Point blank, period. That was the end of story. So that truly would be the best way if you wanted to diversify not just Ivy League, but most universities in general. That would be the way to do it.
Yeah. I also want to just briefly bring up something that Walter Ben Michaels, since we already brought him up, sometimes talks about, and I think this is important as well. I agree with you. I mean, I support, Sanders and Jayapal's free college for all bill. I do think that making college free or even just more affordable is definitely a worthwhile goal. That said, Walter points out something interesting, which is that when you look at the fastest growing jobs in the economy right now, in the US economy, it's things like home healthcare aid, right? Like things that don't require a college degree. And these are terrible jobs. These jobs are low paid, they're precarious. These workers, like I said, make pennies. They don't enjoy stable work schedules. These are terrible jobs. And sending everybody to college, like let's say that there was free college for everybody. Everybody could get a college education. Those would still be the fastest growing jobs. And what that would, and like making college free doesn't fix the problem of bad jobs. So it's something that we have to attend to in addition to also providing more paths for people to go to college, right? And the reason I bring that up is because I think a lot of the times in the US, it's like, oh, well, you want, a dignified, decent life, go to college. Right. And like, we should make that possible, but it should also be the case that like, you can get that without college.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this obsessive mindset with college is kind of built on accepting the premise that and all these other jobs are just going to remain crap and there's no way. When in fact, of course, making cars in the 1920s used to be a terribly paid job, and that got better through the labor movement. So yeah, I mean, we shouldn't accept this premise that if you're in a job that doesn't require a college degree, you're screwed. There's nothing we can do about it. That's like a false choice that we don't have to make.
Right.